Hello, beautiful people. In today's episode, I'm joined by Stu Fortier, and Stu is someone who helps online writers produce their best work. He's a former CTO and head of a writing group called Compound Writing, which I was fortunate enough to be a member of for 3 months, and it's an incredible group worth checking out. And in this writing group, Stu has interviewed well-known editors, bloggers, and professional writers. And on the side, he also has a wildly popular newsletter called Stu's Letter, where he is currently attempting to trade a grain of rice for an actual mountain. More on that in this conversation. And a quick heads up, you guys are joining this conversation in the middle of it, meaning there was no formal introductions or anything like that. I cut it in the middle. So it's just me going on a rant in the beginning, but you will get a lot from Stu in this episode. That's all I got for now, and if you enjoyed this episode, let me know on Twitter at HeyDannyMiranda, or feel free to sign up to my newsletter, Tuesday Treasure. You can find that at DannyMiranda.com/Tuesday. Without further ado, guys, let's get to it.
Interesting people, thought-provoking conversations, nutrition for your brain. Journey through the minds of the world's top performers and discover what it really takes to achieve your highest version. This is the Danny Miranda Podcast.
So that's the biggest difference between us and a previous generation, say our parents, is that I think in the past, our parents viewed things more from a hierarchical perspective, where they had a boss, where they looked up to celebrities. Today, I feel a much more peer relationship in terms of we communicate via the internet, where you can literally reply to a quote-unquote celebrity and they'll reply back to you. And that would never have happened in public in 1970 or 1980. There just wasn't that opportunity to do so. Sure, you could send them a letter, but it wasn't the same thing. And so I think that's something that makes our generation so special, is the peer relationship as opposed to a hierarchical one. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I love that. I think you nailed it, that the internet is, I think, what's kind of powering this shift, because I do think it's a shift. I think when you have a few companies and individuals, not in a conspiratorial way, who own the means of distribution, when it was very expensive to set up the cable television networks across the U.S. before computers were affordable. You only had a handful of companies and people who controlled, you can only play so many TV shows in a given day. And so the people who own access to those channels have like a tight filter on who gets, who gets featured and who gets broadcast. And if you get on television, like in a lot of ways, you have the power dynamic is so shifted because you control the means of distribution, and attention can kind of flow one way from you to many people. But the internet obviously completely undermines that. And like now anybody can, like you said, reply to the tweet very easily. There's no friction. Similarly, anybody can go out there and like build their own damn audience, like one by one over, a long period of time. So like there's way more competition too. So you can't even like rest on your laurels just because you got a big movie deal. You kind of have to, if you really want to be famous and maintain that fame, I think there's just way more competition for people's attention. So I think it would lead to a lot of those structures being undermined, like you mentioned, like, our parents' generation, because I think it's just like harder to actually pull off. I don't think it's impossible to pull off. There's still plenty of, I know Oprah won't reply to my tweets, but I think like a lot of that's being undermined by the internet.
And you've written in depth about this. This is something that you're super passionate about it, and you've shown how people have used the internet to create massive success for themselves and how they've done that. So talk a little bit about that article that you wrote and just about the findings that you found about people using the internet to create success for themselves.
Yeah, for sure. I think that I think we're living in this really strange like in between time of information being very expensive and costly to distribute, think of like the printing press and even things like newspapers and books and moving slowly into radio and television, which is like cheaper but still very expensive to build out the infrastructure behind and get people on devices that could actually receive the communications from that technology. So I think like we live in this strange in-between time of like where it used to be extremely costly and for most of human history extremely slow for information to spread, to a time in which the vast majority of the earth is going to be on an affordable internet-connected device that literally is connected to a network where, you know, essentially every human being is a node. And like everybody kind of knows this on an intellectual level, and anyone who's young like understands what the internet is on some basic, you know, to some basic extent. But the reality is like we haven't actually seen its impact yet. Like we're just starting to see the clues of what it means for anybody on Earth to be able to communicate with anybody else, for anybody on Earth to broadcast their ideas and to like, you know, amass some sort of following. And like, you know, if you used to be, and sorry, I should add, this is happening at the same time where, you know, a lot of work is shifting to knowledge work. So if you're a plumber, the internet, I think it actually could still be unbelievably valuable for you. You actually could use it to become like the richest plumber on Earth. But if you were literally going to be going into homes and fixing people's plumbing, you know, you have to do that locally. So you like, it's a physical thing. It's a, you know, it's a labor force of one. You have to be there to actually do the work. Something like that, you know, maybe isn't totally disrupted by something like the internet, but knowledge work where maybe I'm paid for my ideas or, you know, I'm whatever, a product manager who thinks through product strategy in a specific industry. You know, it used to be that like, I basically just go get a job in my town. Like typically throughout history, like you just get employed by whatever people are nearby who need help. And like that is the extent of the opportunities that come your way. And if there's no opportunities in your village, like you have to go to the next one. And like that's how careers worked for like ever.
Crazy to think
obviously
about.
On the internet, like that's totally different because like everybody on the planet is on this thing. And if you're super smart or super good at one thing, honestly, if you're just like pretty good, just above average, and you're actively broadcasting that online, I mean, that's the equivalent of being in 1 million villages at once offering your services. Like there's a lot of detail behind that. Like that is the shift that the internet enables. And so if you're a blacksmith back in the day, like you can just go do blacksmith stuff in your tiny ass town. Now you can like go on the internet and like help out, you know, whatever, 10,000 people who need you and like find the most qualified people that want you and find the work that's most suited for you. And I think like all these big quote unquote disruptions, they actually like, you can understand them in theory and like be like, why the hell hasn't this actually happened yet? And like, I think we always underestimate how long things take. Mm-hmm. And so I'm convinced like, you know, the internet really hasn't been around that long if you think about it. And I'm just convinced that like we just haven't even seen this play out yet. Like it's just starting. So anyways, in this blog post I wrote, I covered a lot of the people who I think are the early signs of what's to come. Folks like, obviously one stereotypical example might be like a Tim Ferriss, who his podcast alone, first of all, gets more distribution than, you know, many major news outlets. But I mean, it brings in enough ad revenue that I did the math that it could trade on the NASDAQ standalone company, and his payroll is literally smaller than a convenience store. So in that case, he's leveraging the internet to create a media business and, you know, go more for the influence, like high margin media business, an opportunity like that. But then there's a lot of folks who use writing online for their career. And a really simple example, just like one tiny example, is like there was some 18-year-old college freshman who tweeted about, I think like a security vulnerability in Zoom and like explained how the vulnerability worked and explained how to fix it. And like the CEO of Zoom, a deca-billion-dollar company, maybe more than that now, like saw this kid's tweet. Obviously that kid has now been hired. Like he now has a direct line to the CEO of this enormous corporation. And that would have been like extremely hard to do quite a while ago. Like that kid would have been working in mom's basement and like the CEO of no company would ever know his name. And there's just all these stories in between. So anyways, that's kind of like the shift that's happening. I think we're just in the first inning of this thing. And like, I'm convinced that if you're not sharing online, even to some basic extent, you quite literally might as well be living in a cave today.
Well, that's an incredible quote that I agree with, but it's so interesting. Does Did this always come to you naturally? And when did you realize, like, oh shit, the internet's real, the internet is going to make a big difference? I was 13 when I first started my first blog on the internet, and so that would have made you 18. Did you know at an early age, like, okay, this is real, this is something that's going to uproot society? When did you realize that, if you can remember?
Yeah, it's a great question. I know it's embarrassing to say that I definitely don't think I truly grasped this until literally the last like 5 or so years, where I actually like connected all the dots. Because I think I thought a few things. I think one, I just thought, technology was cool. I've always thought technology is really interesting, but I did not have a sense of context of like what period of history are we living in, and like how is it different than the vast majority of history. And when you don't have a sense of context, you don't have a sense of like change, and you don't have a sense of like where you stand on this continuum of like these paradigm shifts that happen every few centuries. And so as a result, you kind of like just take everything at face value as like normal and almost like static. So I was like, well, the internet's been around for a little while. Like pretty much everyone's using email, has a Facebook account, stuff like that. So like probably the impact of the internet has largely played out because it's just like part of society now. But as I actually like started to learn a little bit more about the history of like just the most basic history of like human civilization, it's like, okay, this is actually not normal at all. This thing is truly new if you zoom out the time frame a little bit. And like knowing that, you can actually start to see we're not like in a static place in history. Like we're actually like on this rocket ship, in my opinion, that really is moving, and it's moving in a direction that I think, it's hard to always predict, but I think we can have some general sense of. So that was one. And then the second thing was like just super straightforward. There was like one specific story that really just like utterly rocked my world when I actually just thought about it. And that's the story of my favorite newsletter, which is The Hustle. And The Hustle was started by this guy, Sam Parr, who quite literally just like sat in his living room, once a week, once every few days, and like started to write this email. In his case, he was writing an email list to help promote a conference. But ultimately, people really enjoyed the emails he was writing and started to just subscribe to like read his thoughts about business and startups and like entrepreneurs. And so like pretty quickly, you had a few thousand subscribers, and then saw the business in this media type approach rather than just doing events. And actually invested in finding a handful of writers to write a daily newsletter. And over the course of, a couple, 2 or 3 years, amassed an audience of a few 100,000 people who were reading the work and the ideas of, literally in some cases 2 or 3 writers, in some cases just him. And when I actually thought of like that specific example, I literally started to like Google images of like, what does 500,000 people look like? Like if you had 500,000 people standing out in what would that look like? And of course, it's just stunningly huge crowd. And then as they've gotten closer to 1 million subscribers now far on that, that scale is even more remarkable. So it struck me like that is just unprecedented and unbelievable that one person, you can just sit in your living room in your box on a Sunday and like your ideas can be injected into that many people. That is unbelievable to me. So then I just like started to get obsessed with like writing online and newsletters and that sort of thing. So I think those are the 2 aha moments, but way after my 18th birthday, unfortunately.
Well, that's incredible. And it's so interesting to think about what we see these numbers all the time, like 500,000 subscribers or whatever, like these huge numbers, like even to have 1,000 people follow you on Twitter or whatever it may be. I don't know how many people will listen to this podcast other than my mom. Probably like 100, right? Maybe 100 people if I'm lucky. But to think about that we're sitting in a room now. Imagine us sitting in a room and there's an audience out there at an auditorium and there's 100 people listening. It's a little overwhelming. You're going to change the way you think about things. But that's what the internet really is. You can't see it, so it's very hard to grasp. But when you put it in the perspective of like 30,000 people, okay, that's a football stadium full of people looking at your work. And it becomes a little bit easier to say, oh my God, this is really real here.
You articulated it perfectly. There's this amazing obscure blog post that I revisit every once in a I'll just call it visualizing crowd sizes, and you can look it up. It's quite literally what it claims to be. Like, here's a photo of what 50 people look like. Here's a photo of 100 people. And it goes all the way up to, I think, maybe 50 or 100,000. And it's funny because, like you said, you hear a number like James Clear, I think, has like 800,000 email subscribers. And like, intuitively, you're like, oh, I think that's a lot. But, there's like billions of people on Earth. Like, is that super big? Is that big? And Tim Ferriss has over 1 million people on his like Friday email. And that's more people than were at the Obama inauguration. So if you Google photos of that, that was like the largest gathering of human beings in like all of human history, apparently. And like Tim Ferriss emails that many people like every week about mushroom coffee. Like, it's insane. So I think you're right. I think like, and obviously like, there's plenty of details around like, a lot of the times, you only have their attention for the 3 minutes that they're skimming your email. Maybe it's not like you have a direct line into their minds or anything like that. But overall, I mean, the scale and the leverage is just like, to me, tough to fathom. And also, I think that's very encouraging when you're getting started out. Like, oh, I only have, a couple hundred people on my email list. Like 200 people, like you said, if you're an auditorium with 200 people and you were giving a speech, like you'd probably be pretty nervous. And these are 200 human beings. Like if you need something or like want help on something, like some percentage of them will chime in and you'll have this incredible tailwind that you wouldn't have had if you didn't have that audience. So I think it's very encouraging even when you're getting started out. It's like, don't get discouraged because you don't have 1 million people following your stuff. Like you have 100 people, that's actually really interesting and almost like intrinsically worth it, in my opinion. But yeah, I think you're right. When you actually visualize these things, it becomes much clearer.
So going back to what you were saying about how like you had an aha moment almost with the hustle and seeing how crazy writing online could be, was that one of the influences for starting your current venture? We can call it Compound Writing. Is that why you started it?
They are inextricably linked. So I think for me, it's kind of hilarious. When I originally went through that hustle, like truly appreciated what was going on with the hustle. Obviously now there's since plenty of other really popular newsletters that have launched doing kind of a similar model. I started to think about like, okay, that like as a business, like a paid newsletter or excuse me, a newsletter that you can monetize would be super interesting and compelling. And I think it's largely because like the Venn diagram of things that I like doing. I've always loved writing. It's always been a hobby of mine. And then like business opportunities, things you can like justify spending your time on kind of overlap. I saw like the overlap and was like, okay, sweet. There's obviously a ton I've learned about since. You have to really think about marketing, and there's like a whole bunch of other stuff that goes into something like the hustle. It's not as easy as just writing the thing. But I started to experiment with a few different like newsletter ideas. And one, I think the one that really got the most traction, and I've since shifted into Compound because I think it's a much better opportunity. But I actually launched a satirical newsletter about the tech industry that a few thousand people subscribe to. It's not huge. But
that's huge, like we were saying.
Oh, totally. It's like way to me, like way more than I would have expected, and like it was a super fun project. But I hit up a couple friends who are brilliant kind of comedy writers. One lives in LA, one lives in New York, and it was like, we need to do the Onion for tech, and we need to do it kind of does like we need to make this a newsletter that tech people will read because it's a super high value audience. And so we did. We launched this like satirical newsletter that came out once a week. And you can look it up at techloaf.io. There's some other folks running it now, but it was pretty fantastic. People loved it. It was shared organically. We paid $0 in growth, got it up to a few thousand people. Projects came up, wasn't able to give it the time it needed to grow to a real place where you can monetize it. But it did start to show me. I mean, we had random on the list, like pitching us to write, like volunteering to help us design the email, volunteering to help set up the website, help us with marketing, like we could sponsor. And that was just from like, again, this quote unquote relatively small audience of a few thousand people, where I was like, whoa, this is like, because it's humor and it's a fun kind of project, it wasn't like the best business in the world, but it really started to illustrate, like validate some of those ideas I had that I noticed with the hustle and some other folks writing newsletters. So anyways, long story short, I have my own personal blog and I've been building up my own personal list on the side for fun. And I just started to like get familiar with some of the challenges of like writing online consistently. Because with software requires a lot of maintenance, but in general, you can build something once and you can sell it 100 times. With content, every week you kind of have to ship something new, and you have to like put in the work to keep creating new stuff that's interesting. And that actually is kind of true of software as well. And it's underappreciated, but regardless, after you hit publish, like you're back to zero every week. And what I noticed with like writing online, like one of the big challenges is like, because so many people are starting to share their ideas online, your stuff just has to be really good, like fairly consistently to make it. And people just have a short attention span, like especially with writing, where you could jump over and watch TikTok, which would be way more fun. Like your writing has to be pretty compelling to like suck people in and really help them find value out of it. So I think, again, it's just like particular to online writing, people are not going to sit down and read, my thoughts on blank, like this 5,000 word essay on, like, people just don't have the attention span. So the challenge is like, how do you write really excellent stuff? And how do you do that pretty consistently? Mm-hmm. And so I'm kind of convinced that with writing, very often, if you have a full-time job, it's pretty tough to ship stuff consistently. But if you do have enough time to write, I think the real magic in writing, like almost no one is proud of their first draft. And the real magic comes with great editing and feedback. So like, when you've actually kind of vomited out this first draft, how do you then go and like chop this thing up to make it distilled down to the super valuable stuff and make that the thing that like the process that really matters? And so anyways, a good friend of mine, Dan Hunt, kind of pitched me on this idea of like, hey, we should like start a group with writers who basically swap feedback on each other's work. And like, no one really has the budget to hire a professional editor. And like, when you ask grandma to review your stuff, like she's pretty supportive and not actually giving you constructive feedback. And every time you have to ask your friends for feedback, it's kind of like you're burning an ask. And typically they're blindly supportive as well. So all that to say, like, okay, we should like start this group where we only let in folks who are really talented writers. And the whole idea is that they edit and contribute to each other's work. And there's since been a lot more thinking that we've put into this. But like that's the core idea, editing and feedback. Like let's make that the core value prop for the group, and everything on top of that's kind of gravy. So, anyways, that's what launched Compound Writing, and I'm happy to get more into it. But that was like the long winding story of launching the first version of it.
Yeah, I absolutely love hearing that, and it's very cool to see how your thought process evolved and how you just came up with that idea and why you came up with it. From my perspective, as someone who's used the service and who's someone who has been in the group, it is everything. It is an awesome service to use, an awesome way to improve your writing and to see that feedback. So hats off to you for doing it right and doing a great job. Talk a little bit about what you've also done with that group is you get some amazing writers to not only be in the group, but also to just give their time so that you can interview them and that they could help people who are writing in the group. So talk to me a little bit about how you've allowed or how you've been able to get such great writers to be able to interview and talk to them. Is it like, how are you doing this? Because I've been so curious about that.
Well, yeah, first of all, appreciate the kind words. And secondly, I think like, I don't know if it's, there's some nice tailwinds going on. It's COVID, everyone's locked at home, and, people are really, don't mind spending more time on Zoom and stuff like that. And people are, stuck at home looking for stuff to do. Yeah, I think there's some nice little tailwinds that we're riding, but overall, I think I think that writers have some degree of empathy and appreciation for how challenging the work is. And oftentimes I think they're still trying to work through it themselves. This is like probably one of the biggest things I've learned interviewing all these amazing writers is how many of them are still fear the blank page, still don't feel like they've quite figured out their voice, are still trying to figure out, how to keep shipping good stuff. And I think, often what looks like a impenetrable fort from the outside, often there's still a lot of work and, a lot of effort that's being put in behind the scenes. So I think first of all, because of that struggle, a lot of people are just very willing to be generous and to help out other folks. So that's like one, I think, reason why a lot of these fantastic writers have been, generous enough to join us for calls, generous enough to do a lot of these workshops with us. The other thing is, I think a lot of writers kind of toil away in obscurity, and they actually do, even though they're pretty well known, they do a lot of their work kind of by themselves in a vacuum. And so long as the members in Compound are excellent writers, which we try to like filter for very tightly, and so long as they take it seriously, the folks we interview are kind of excited to join the group and to like bounce some ideas off of folks in the group because of that, because they know the other people in the group are dedicated to the craft. They know the other people in the group could help augment some of their work and help improve the quality of what they're doing. And it's really not, writers on the internet, writers don't really compete in a lot of ways because like the surface area is so huge of what can be written about. So it's like it can kind of be this non-zero sum game where folks can truly help each other out. And so I think the other filter there is like, are there other high quality members that these writers can gain value from, even if they're not folks who are known, which I think is really cool about writing. You don't need to have high status to give great feedback on a piece of work. You don't need to be famous to give thoughtful critiques on a blog post. Like, you just need to be like kind of sharp and thoughtful. And there's a lot of unknown people on the internet, like in the world, who don't have like 20,000 Twitter followers, but who are just as sharp, just as thoughtful, and just as willing to help as somebody who does. So anyways, I think these like well-known writers actually just appreciate thoughtful feedback from wherever it comes. And we kind of designed this group that revolves around editing and feedback and contribution. So I think those are a few of my theories of like why these people have been so generous, and joined us.
Yeah. I mean, it's crazy because what you speak to is like something that I feel every writer struggles with is like, I'm not a writer, or this piece isn't good enough, or am I really any good at all? Even if you have had pieces that do well or pieces or people tell you you're a good writer, it still is difficult to just be able to convince yourself that what you're doing is still good work. And maybe that's just my own internal struggles that I'm projecting out into other people, but that's something that I've seen time and time again from writers is the belief that they're not good enough, or the belief that, I think what it is, this is what I think it is, and let me know if you agree, is like writers look up to other writers and they see other people's work that they admire, and they naturally, intuitively compare their own work to that of someone else. And when you do that, and your comparisons for your writing are amazing, amazing writers, then it could make you look as if your own stuff isn't that good, but someone else who's reading your stuff, their comparisons might be other people who they're not comparing your work to, they're just comparing you to you. And I think that's why we fall into the trap, particularly as writers, as just kind of like self-deprecating. What do you think about that?
Oh, I love that. I totally agree. I think like comparison is like this almost like inescapable urge that we all have. And not only are you comparing yourselves to some of, the greats, obviously when something's been published, it's like the final work, and what you're seeing, the only thing you're ever seeing with most writing is the final work. And you have no context on what actually happened behind the scenes. And meanwhile, you're sitting there with the blank Google Doc being like, Jesus, like this first draft sucks. And like, I don't even know what I'm trying to say. And little do you know, many of those writers behind the scenes had that exact same experience coming up with this genius work. It took them 3 months. Like, it took them 12 drafts. Like, their editor ripped the thing in half the first time they read it. And obviously you don't know that because you're just seeing the finished movie. You're seeing the final production, and you're never seeing the actual behind the scenes stuff. So that's one. And I agree. It's because like it's the only data point you have is the published piece, because like most writers are not posting a 3-hour live stream of them editing. Like you just have no information of what's going on behind the scenes. So yeah, default information you have is the published work. The published work is fantastic. So you end up comparing yourself to it and you feel pretty bad. Again, not knowing what actually went on behind the scenes to make that work possible. I think the second thing I would add, and this is a weird one because I'm still trying to figure out quite how to I haven't quite figured out how to articulate it, but I think the second thing that happens is when I think one of the most challenging things writer, and really as a creative person, and frankly, who knows, maybe as a human being, is understanding that the world is very flexible and that your place in it can just kind of appear and be created out of thin air. And so as an example, like you might read all these, Tim Urban from Wait But Why to me is a good example. He's a guy who writes about artificial intelligence, renewable energy, all these, some of Elon Musk companies, all that sort of thing. It's a bit of a stereotypical example because he's so popular, but I think it really is a great example. So he writes about stuff that, literally every day, thousands of people write about. And these are just not new topics. And furthermore, there's plenty of really interesting writing. And for the past 20 years, there's probably been a lot of super interesting books and long form essays written about artificial intelligence and the singularity and whatever. And so it seems like this stuff is pretty well covered. But how he approached articulating these ideas was just totally new, and new in the sense of it was a combination of humor, self-deprecating writing style, really funny images and graphics, and deep topics where he does a serious deep dive on something very important. And that little Venn diagram that he kind of created has just never been seen before, and it just kind of blew up. And probably everyone listening to this will know who the blog Wait But Why, and probably has encountered some of Tim Urban's work. But to me, he's an example of that's not an example of the right way of this is how people should write. To me, it's an example of how you can just appear and your work can just enter kind of the hallways of greatness, if you will, just because you actually did something kind of original and that was only you could do. And so I think the other challenge with writing is you have this very static view of the landscape. Okay, this is how people write about business strategy. Okay, this is how people write about product management. This is how people write about AI. And you get kind of you pigeonhole yourself into boundaries that were defined by other writers who were just willing to be original. And if you let that fear lock you up, you won't come up with these original ways of framing things like a Tim Urban does, as again, just one really powerful example. So I think that's the other thing. It's you don't feel like you neatly fit into any of these boxes, and it's very discouraging, and you end up kind of losing some self-confidence. But I think the opposite reaction is necessary. Okay, how could I combine the things that I like in a way that's just going to people will they'll compare themselves to me once I have some success. So long-winded answer, but I think that's another factor.
Dude, I just got chills from listening to that part, because what you speak to is the uniqueness of the individual and how important it is to embrace your own uniqueness, and how comparison is just a false game you're playing, and no one can beat you at being you. And if you truly embrace that and you truly start to figure out as a writer, okay, how can I be more like me? How can I present the real me onto the page? How can I do that? Then that is a competitive advantage that other people can try to copy, but they're never going to succeed at that. So it's just an incredible, incredible point. It's something that I'm going to think about for a long time in the future.
I think you're spot on. And I think I do think it's a lot of trial and error. It's a lot of it looks obvious in hindsight, and people will reverse engineer how you did it and it will seem so obvious, but you're exactly right. It's I love that, I love that quote, nobody can compete with you on being you. And of course, you want to make sure you're providing value to folks, and you don't want to get too into yourself or whatever, and lose sight of how you can use your uniqueness to help other people. But I think that's really the challenge. It's what is my area of genius? Again, to use another, I think, term that's making the rounds. How do I really just develop some confidence that my tastes and intuitions are right? And obviously, Tim Urban blogged in obscurity for a few years. You can go look up Underneath the Turban, which was his first blog. 200 people followed it, just his friends. He was writing for years, doing his little stick figures. Exactly, yeah, doing his stick figures, and for literally years, and kind of figuring out his own unique spin on blogging and writing online, and just following his gut a little bit. And then I think if I was doing my own little narrative, retrospective on him, it seems like he just spun all of that into Wait But Why, which was okay, I kind of have my voice figured out. Now I'm going to go apply it to these really interesting areas. And by that point, he's just developed such a unique way of communicating ideas that like no one can touch him. And now, he's just one of a series of ways that you too could blog. But of course, if you just copy him, it's going to be lame. Like you have to do something that will seem surprising.
Yeah, and what I love about that story that I heard about first from Tim Urban on Tim Ferriss's podcast was just that he wrote for 7 years on his own blog for fun because he just enjoyed doing it and it just made sense to him. And it's really, you see Wait But Why, and it really was an overnight success, Wait But Why. Wait But Why, you have Tim Urban, he goes to some random location and he creates the first blog post, and the first blog post gets something absurd, like 500,000 unique visitors. And that was, his first blog post was more popular than I think any one that he created in the next 2 years or something crazy. Point being, that overnight success of Wait But Why was forged in the 7 years of him writing online for fun, where he created his voice, where he figured out what he liked to talk about, and he just knew if he could just put all of his mind into one topic, into just focusing all of his energy on one blog post, he knew it would do really well. And it's really cool to think about that success, that 7 years that he put in, that one success that he has with Wait But Why was forged with 7 years of work.
Yes. It's so true. And I think, again, I know maybe a lot of these quotes are now just in the zeitgeist and people are familiar with them. But I always think back to the Ira Glass quote around, when you're first writing stuff, when you're first doing creative work, you've got killer tastes, but very often your work itself does not live up to the standard that you want to get to. And like typically that's where people quit. Like, okay, I suck at this. Like I'm not a creative person or whatever the story is. And you kind of give up on it and you move on. And obviously that's kind of a shame because if you do have enough intrinsic motivation, like you mentioned, you just kind of basically toiled in obscurity, although I'm sure he was having some fun with it, until Wait But Why, when he finally was able to apply these skills in a way that really worked. Most people just give up before they get there. And so like we don't actually understand the potential and the genius that a lot of folks possess because you just kind of give up or you forget about your why. And I think I totally get it. I think it's very tempting to quit. But yeah, there's like this kind of hump that you have to get over to finally get to a place where you can do true original work.
And that's why I love the idea of compound writing, right? Your writing group is like compound. You're writing, and the more you write, the more it compounds on the internet, and the more your skills increase, and the more chances you have and leverage you have and connections you can draw from and people who get drawn into you. It's like compound is really what writing is all about, and especially writing on the internet. So that's why I think it's such a brilliant name and certainly speaks to the truth of what writing on the internet really is.
Yeah, you're so right. I mean, your ideas compound and build on each other because if you're attracted to a few topics, you can constantly be kind of citing your work and building this mind map of how you think. The paper trail, if you will, that you leave behind you really compounds because a lot of I still get cold outreach on a few posts that I've done here and there. And like actually the post about sharing your ideas online, I've gotten, the most traffic in the last months on that post than I did when I first launched it and promoted it. So there's like this great long tail effect or this great kind of delayed compounding effect where a lot of your content over time can actually become more valuable or continue to be valuable far after you hit publish. That's just the first step. And so, I'm totally convinced. It's not always. There's plenty of content that folks produce that just stays in obscurity, and often your best posts are the ones that outdo 80% of your next post. There is a power law type effect, but overall, the trend is that these things build on each other, and like if you continue to invest in it over a long period of time. That's where you start to actually see the real rewards. But obviously, it does take a while. It's like the marshmallow test, and like most people are just going to quit, and like naturally so. But if you can hold out, like all things that compound, the rewards come in the back half.
So let's talk about that real quick. What are some of the ways you believe that someone can stick with it?
Yeah, so this comes from being a chronic procrastinator, but I need fear as a motivator, and particularly like accountability is the nice way of saying it, but like fear and guilt and shame are the honest like tools to use.
I
And
love
so
the
this is
honesty.
totally, it's just like I think it can be useful here at least. But this is the whole reason that I launched my personal newsletter. It was not, did not have a strategy. It was just like, I'm going to write something that I find interesting every week, but I know that I will not write every week if I don't tell people that I'm going to do this. And if there's not, folks on the other end of this, like waiting for it every Sunday. So I was just like, I know myself. So for maybe like step one, know thyself. I know that I will, it's like skipping the gym. It's like the easiest thing to kick off the to-do list in a busy day. So anyway, I had to develop forcing functions. And for me, that was like shipping something every week. I think the other frankly, that was like the big one for me, like publicly holding yourself accountable to a specific goal. So maybe it's, I'm going to do one podcast a week. I'll write one newsletter. I'll publish one thing on YouTube. It's amazing, like the energy that you can generate, and just like, post it on Facebook or something, ask 10 friends to sign up, and like, honestly, problem solved. So that's one. I think the second thing, and this is what I've really learned with Compound, is surrounding yourself with people who are also doing similar things. It's like any behavior that you want to start doing more of, just being around people who do that thing, good or bad, will just kind of help like nudge you in the direction of doing it more often. Like, we're very mimetic creatures. And if everyone's like shipping and writing stuff, it is very motivating. You're like, okay, other people are getting this done. They're all so busy. Like, what's my excuse? And you really get motivated to get stuff done. So I think in Compound, we've like explicitly set up some accountability stuff, like set some goals, and I'll check in with you. And I think that stuff's really useful. But I think like the second order thing that actually ends up being very motivating is just seeing other people do the behavior you want to do, seeing that it's possible, seeing that other people are consistent. I think that's, another great way to just like, motivate yourself.
Awesome. I love those two, and I think they're super useful. Switching gears a little bit, is you've edited so many posts in Compound. And so I'm super curious, like, your feedback is just amazing, but you have so many pieces of advice, and you're everywhere on the feedback and editing side of things. What are the biggest mistakes you found from all this editing?
Oh, and I love this question, because I think I am convinced that the biggest hack for writing and like improving your writing, like the most efficient way to become a better writer, easier said than done, but I think it's to actually edit other people's writing. I think it can be very hard to actually edit your own objectively, so it's easier to edit other people's stuff. And so I think like one thing I would advise folks to do, if you have some writing inclined friends, like offer to be their editor, because you'll be pretty astounded at like how useful seeing and noticing, whatever the issues that other folks encounter as they write is like just spectacular for starting to find your own blind spots. So I think just like in general, keep that in mind as you like think about how do I improve as a writer. But more specifically, like what are some of the things that most folks who are writing, what are the kind of the mistakes they make? First of all, I'll just say there's nobody who writes a perfect first draft. So when you write, the whole point of a first draft is to it's like, you're just like figuring out the plot of land where you're going to dig for some diamonds and hoping, there might be a few diamonds there. So I think with the first draft, like at base, you really don't beat yourself up over it. All you're trying to do is lay some ground where there might be a few diamonds worth kind of digging up and, pulling up. So that doesn't mean don't invest in it. Doesn't mean don't work hard on it. But I think don't beat yourself up if it sucks. So I think every nobody is thrilled with their first draft. The specific, like most common things that I see in Compound when someone actually like ships a draft, I kind of came up with like 5 of what I think are the most like consistent points of feedback that I give. The first, and I am so guilty of this, but since joining Compound, starting and being a member of Compound, I think gotten much better, are throat clearing intros where you spend literally like 5 paragraphs explaining, like giving a backstory on what your idea is. And the reality is, like, if you are Barack Obama, and this is your autobiography, and everyone's already super interested in your life, you can afford to clear your throat and like people will stick around. But most of us, like, people are just not that interested in what we have to say, like, frankly. So like, and often you're just not actually adding a lot of signal, and people are online. Again, TikTok is one click away. They'll bail on your stuff if it's not interesting. So first and foremost, short intros, give the juice up front. There's this great writer, Lenny Rachitsky, who gave this advice in one of the compound workshops, which is like, just give away the goods right away. Like, just don't even, the goods can be a whole bunch of different things, but like, just give it right away and then see if people want to stick around, because people just don't have patience. The second thing, I mean, this honestly might be just as frequent, is the use of very like abstract language. And sometimes this makes sense. Like, sometimes your audience does use these abstractions, and sometimes like you're writing about a very complex thing that does require a high degree of abstraction to make sense. But like, a lot of folks, it's very tempting to like try and sound smart and like use broad sweeping statements, like broad language that captures a lot of ideas, but it's actually like totally useless for the reader because they don't actually know what you're talking about. And so just like keep it simple, right? Literally write like you're writing for a kid. And I know it's like so hard to do because people think that simple is dumb, like simple equals dumb, but I think like the exact opposite is true. So anyways, avoid this abstract language. That is super common. The other thing that, again, I'm guilty of all these things myself, is not having a clear intention with a piece. So it's like, okay, you're writing this blog post. It's pretty amazing, like how hard it is to actually get clear with like, what the hell is my intention writing this thing? And your intention can be all sorts of things. It might be like, I want to move people to tears and tell a beautiful story. Or I want to give people practical advice they can go use to improve their email marketing funnel. Like, you can like you can be flexible with what the intention is, but you do have to state it and you do have to know it yourself. So for me, like with my Why You Should Share Ideas Online post, I kind of put the intention in the title. I want to convince you of the opportunity of sharing your ideas online. And if nothing else, I want to at least articulate what that opportunity is. And without that intention, that post really could have been way too broad. And so you do have to get clear of like, what am I trying to achieve? And then the last two are pretty short, is like overusing like caveats and qualifiers. I think we want to make sure that we're not misinterpreted or misconstrued or misunderstood. And I do think that's very well intentioned. And I think there's a time and a place for that. But typically when you're, if you're tweeting or if you're writing a blog post, like, people are just not going to get, they're not out there to get you. And they don't need a perfect construction of your worldview. So like, just get to like the meat of what you're trying to say, and then figure out the caveats later. Like, I'm not saying this, and in this situation, this might not be true. Like, don't bore people with that up front. Just like get to the meat of it, go for the jugular. If people are interested, great. Like, add those caveats later. Final actual thing, and this is like a theme I think throughout all of these, is like, don't lose momentum. So just like when you're reading your own work, think of like where things are about to get a little bit dry and intense and like hard to get through, and just like inject a little bit of momentum. Like, okay, if I'm about to break down and very detailed breakdown of like Tim Ferriss's costs of his podcast, which might be kind of dry or boring, like, let me just inject a teaser of why this is interesting. Like, you won't believe how much revenue he makes with this little expenses. I'll get to that later. You can just kind of inject little things that if you're about to kind of share something dry but important, will keep a reader, it'll remind them of why they should care about this, of what's coming next. And you can do this in very subtle ways, but just kind of when you're reading over your own work, it's like, where could I inject a little bit of momentum just to like keep people really kind of enthralled? So that's the actual list. I've broken all my rules by making that way too long.
Dude, I love it. And I can't believe this is free and that you're just giving us this gold for nothing. I mean, this is incredible. And thank you so much for breaking that all down, because, I've read your writing on this specific topic, but it's so interesting because when I hear it again, I feel like I learned something new. So I don't know if that's ever happened to you, but it's like repetition. And it's like, that's a good reason for someone who is writing something, right? And you're like, oh, well, everyone else has already written about this, or I've already written about this. Well, maybe someone didn't get it the first time, or maybe it didn't become clear to that person. So I think there's something to be said. Going back to your point about writing online, is like, you got to put yourself out there, and don't be afraid to repeat yourself or say something that you've already said before in a slightly different way, because that might hit someone in a different way, and that might be useful as well.
Yeah, I think you're so right. And so much of this stuff is like stuff that I'm just reminding myself about. And like, it's really easy to forget. And, I've heard it a million times. It's easy to forget. I think, I remember like one of my favorite tweets of all time, I think was from Cortland Allen from Indie Hackers. And basically he was saying like, probably a lot of the most useful advice that we get is stuff we've already heard 1,000 times. Like, we just need to actually do it. And we're always looking for the next thing, and we're looking for the next hack or whatever. And it's very tempting because we think once we've heard something that we know it. But of course, like, actually putting something in practice is the challenge, and doing that as a habit and part of our, just how we operate, I think is really hard. And I think like you do have to like repeat things to yourself, remind yourself of like the quote unquote basics. I think this is why like stating things that are super obvious to you is actually like very valuable, especially if you're like someone who's creating content online. Like, the stuff that seems painfully obvious to you is actually like the stuff that a lot of your audience follows you to learn about, and like it's not really part of their day to day maybe, or like your specific insights. So stuff that seems super obvious to Ben Thompson is probably unbelievably helpful for his readers. And so, anyways, kind of to your point, right? I think it's pretty hard to truly bore people or feel like a broken record online, because I think a lot of folks are just like, they want you to share those basic things that matter, and to be reminded of those things. So yeah, I'm with you.
Absolutely. And it speaks to the uniqueness element of like, you're sharing what's obvious to you might not be obvious to someone else. And it actually may be the connector that allows them to make an insight, or to come up with something or to do something that they know they should have been doing, And so I relate to that 100%. So
couldn't agree more.
So changing gears a little bit, you currently, at the time of this recording, you currently have this mission to trade a piece of rice for an actual mountain. And I couldn't go through this podcast without asking you why you came up with this idea, how you came up with it, and just what were you thinking, my man? And I'm super excited to follow this journey, but it's an incredible thing. Talk to me a little bit about that.
Totally. So I'll be the first to admit that I'm not the first person to attempt something similar, and hopefully not the last person to succeed. But there was a guy, I think in like 2004, who traded like a red paper clip, and folks may know this guy, but this guy who traded a red paper clip all the way up to a house. And so he traded it for like a cool pen, and he traded that pen for like a cool doorknob. And he traded the doorknob for like, an old Walkman or something. Just like went on whatever, I don't know if it was Craigslist or the Canadian equivalent, I think it was based in Canada, in 2004, and like started to make these trades, and ended up like, I think a year and a half later, like getting a house, like someone traded him a house.
Wow.
And I read about that a while ago, and I don't know why I was randomly reflecting on it recently, but I thought about like, first of all, whoa, that's badass. Secondly, like since that happened, the internet has matured so much that you could probably do that again, but make it like way bigger. And there's some other folks maybe who've tried similar things. So I just started thinking like, okay, I write a lot about the power of the internet. I write a lot about the power of like storytelling and communication. So could I kind of like run this experiment again, 15 years later and try to maybe go a little bit more extreme, and, who knows where it goes, but like what would be the more extreme version of this? And I was like, you got to start smaller and you got to end bigger. So instead of a paper clip, I literally just walked around my apartment. This is what happens when my fiance is visiting her family and I'm here by myself. I'm like, this is the shit that I think about. So I'm like walking around my apartment, like a piece of paper, like, a pen, no. And I like open up the pantry and I see like a bag of rice. And I'm like, perfect. Yeah, I'll start with a bag of rice. And then I'm like, wait a minute. I'll start with a grain of rice.
Oh my God.
So I just pull out like a grain of rice. Like, okay, I don't know who's going to trade me for a grain of rice, but like there has to be someone. It's the internet. So on my newsletter, what I want to do, actually, a side note here, is that I want to see how far I can get just with my personal newsletter before I announce it more publicly. So I haven't actually I haven't mentioned it on Twitter. I haven't done anything. I haven't promoted a blog post about it. So I'm just trying it out on my email list to see how far that tiny corner of the internet can go before going bigger. But anyways, announce it in an email. I was like, okay, here's the idea. I'm going to try and trade this thing up all the way to get a literal mountain. Keep trading this thing up until someone trades me the land rights to a mountain. And there are a whole bunch of constraints around a mountain because most big ass mountains are part of national, it's federal land. I'm not going to be able to get one of those. But a mountain is technically anything that's goes 2,000 feet above base elevation.
Oh wow!
So I went on all these websites and there's some very shitty mountains that you can get for $150,000 in Kentucky. And I was like, okay, that's pretty much how much an affordable home would cost. So actually, at a minimum, some of these mountains are very much within reach. It's not like you're trying to get the Matterhorn. You can get something that might actually be doable in the same way that paperclip guy got a house. So then I was like, okay, that was the final bit of research I did. Okay, this can happen. Let's do it. So I announced it to my list. And within, frankly, within a few hours, my email goes out on Sunday, but definitely by Monday morning, I had 25 offers or something for the piece of rice, for the grain of rice. And everyone was like, this is awesome. I'm so stoked to follow along. And the other thing I said was if you offer to help out in any way, which is true, when we get this mountain, you will be invited to the opening party at the mountain. So even if you offer trade, but I don't make the trade, you will still be invited to what's now named Rice Mountain for the opening party. So anyways, the trade that I accepted I felt like it was perfect for a few reasons. The Drew Riley, the guy who I think we both know, writes this newsletter called Trends. Trends is basically he spends a ton of time researching these up and coming startup trends, writes these really succinct, high quality reports on the landscape and how to take advantage of it, and offers a free version of the report, but also offers a paid version where it goes much deeper. And he offered to trade a paid Trends VC report for the rice, which I was this is perfect because A, it doesn't cost him anything to set up a promo code for me, so he's not in the red on this trade. B, it's an information product, so this is just cool because my whole thing is the internet is super powerful and value can be just created on the internet. So I thought that was great. And it's just very easy to trade this thing and that other people will definitely want it. And I don't need to ship a big item to somebody or whatever. So that was the first trade. I'll be announcing, I offered that last week. Again, a bunch of offers came in really quickly. So I will be announcing the actual next trade in my newsletter next week. But I will be going from the digital world to the physical world for this next trade. And I'm convinced it may take a while, but the paperclip guy did this in 17 trades or something in that ballpark.
Wow.
Paperclip to house. So originally I was this is probably going to take 5 years. But now I'm this might actually be something you could do in 30 trades potentially. So
wow.
Anyways, that's the backstory to trying to trade a grain of rice for a literal mountain.
Holy smokes. And I can already see the headlines. Man conquers Rice Mountain. And, it's incredible. It just goes to show, right? The power of taking an idea that's already been done and not saying to yourself, oh, I can't do that, but instead saying, oh, I could do that too in a slightly different way that is more like me or in a more extreme way or whatever. It's really cool how you, instead of, saying, oh, I can't do that, you leaned into it and was this has already been done. So I could do it even better. I could do it more like me, or I could change this up. And I think that's such an important point about the internet and about life in general, right? Is take what you see that you like, copy it, and change it slightly.
I love your framing there. I think you're just so right. I think one of the most discouraging thoughts in the world is this has already been done, therefore case closed. And I think that's just totally false. I think what are you talking about? There's so many different ways to do something that your unique way is what's valuable, very, very often is what's valuable. And I don't know, it's just I think, especially with maybe something like starting a startup or a company, very often competition or the interchangeability of two things is really misunderstood and overvalued or over-indexed on. and that like you just said, your unique spin on something actually ends up being what's valuable and ends up carving out this very distinct place in the world. Versus, I think, whatever, a stereotypically like zero-sum mindset where, this has been done before, I'm not going to do it, or this competitor is already better at me than this. When in reality, maybe the thing that you're trying to do is actually distinct and is more specific, and like there is room for you. I think that there's almost always a way to kind of wedge yourself into the world, even if it looks like it's been done before.
I love that. So talk to me a little bit about creating Compound Writing as a group and what some of the biggest misconceptions you had before starting it and after, because I'm very curious about this.
Ooh, that's a great question. I think I have my answer. So I'll start with what we're trying to not do, or very early on. Compound's not very old, but a few months ago, when we were starting to really think through it, there is, I think, a lot of Twitter's like one of the most amazing things in the world, but I think a lot of folks are starting to think about like these more niche communities where how can I go behind a whether it's a paywall or some other sort of vetting process and hang out with more like-minded people who either share my interests or my skills or my goals or whatever it might be. And how do I become part of like a really curated group around like specific interests or things that are important to me? And then Twitter can do that to an extent, but Twitter's more like the open hangout where you can get connected with a lot of different people. How do I really surround myself with folks in this one area of my life that's important right now? And I think like this has been done before in a ton of different industries. To riff a little bit off the last idea, like there's plenty of, if you want to, if you're like an entrepreneur or something, there's a bunch of different like paid communities and paid groups that you can be a part of to like surround yourself with other entrepreneurs. And like there's a lot of different trade organizations where if you're like work in a certain industry or a certain job function, you can join a trade industry and be a part of, hang out with like vetted peers in your group. But I think very often what happens with like communities, and especially I think it's like particularly bad with new online communities, is a clear lack of purpose in that like just getting a bunch of X type of people together, frankly, is just not enough. I think it can work, and I think it's fine. You can get far enough with it. But I think it like kind of sucks. Like I think you have to have a clear reason to engage. Like, why are we getting together? Is it to mentor each other? Is it to like share advice? Is it to help each other find new business? Is it to like, I think everyone's tempted to just like, well, the opportunities will create themselves. Like, I just want to bring together awesome people. I think that's just the first step. And I don't think that is like the end of the story. And I think it's actually the easy first step. I think the real challenge is like, what is the clear purpose for this group to exist and to, like, why would you engage with this group on an ongoing basis in a meaningful way? And so with Compound, to get to your question, like the thing that we honed in on is like, we are here to help each other edit and contribute to each other's work. There's a ton of other more interesting, like long-term things that can evolve into. But fundamentally, if people are not like sharing drafts to get other people's input on, and if members who share drafts are not also giving input to other members' work, then this is just like a fluffy Slack group that just like does water cooler conversations all the time, which I think, again, is like perfectly fine. I think like I'm part of some of those, and like there's still the interesting stuff still happens. I don't mean to like totally undermine the value of serendipity, but it is a little rudderless. Like you do, I think, have to have a clearer opinion on why this group gets together. So anyways, with Compound, our whole thing was let's really focus on the editing experience, because that's the utility of this group. And so that's kind of what we've tried to center most things around. Not everything's centered around it, but just about everything is. And so that's one. That's how we thought about that. But I think that the opinion of mine that's changed, or like the enlightenment that I've had recently, is like you have to actually do a lot of the softer, fuzzier stuff around that to support it. So like for I think we over-indexed on the editing, the narrative, and like the push for people to edit each other's stuff. And we did under-index on the more community relationship building side, where we're making sure that like members are meeting each other and like members feel like they really are part of a group, not just like a utility where they get feedback. Even though I think feedback is one way to build relationships. So So I think like the thing that we're now thinking about is like, okay, there's actually a lot of like this quote unquote community building stuff that ends up supporting the editing experience, like doing icebreakers with members, pairing people up for one-on-one conversations. Actually, those things end up supporting the editing experience because people will feel more connected to each other and like want to help each other out. But to answer your question, I definitely like under-indexed on that earlier. But other than that, I think like we just have a long to-do list of improvements we know we can make centered around kind of the editing experience, because we believe that's how you become a better writer. And we believe that's just how you do better work, which is like kind of the value that we want to bring to our members.
Awesome, brother. One question that I wanted to ask you was, who are some writers? Because you spend so much time reading, writing, on the internet in general. Who are some writers that people might not have heard about that you really love?
Oh my God. I have a long list. I should like pull up the master list of
those will be in the show notes.
Right? Yeah, I know. Seriously, I will send you the link. Ironically, I think not ironically, I'm not just saying this to as a thank you for having me on the pod, but I think you're a great example of like a really talented writer. And you've got obviously an audience and some momentum building. But I think you intrinsically, because you've been writing so long, like follow a lot of those editing pieces of advice I shared earlier, like get to the goods, inject a lot of momentum in your writing, and you have pretty clear intentions with each piece. So I've had a blast getting to edit some of your stuff. I think a few people that folks wouldn't know. One is someone named Sarah Campbell, and she writes this great newsletter called Tiny Revolutions, which I'll send you a link to. But she writes, it's basically a lot around like mental health and kind of human psychology. And her writing style is just very like, she's mastered like the conversational writing style where you feel like you're sitting down at a bar with a friend and she's just like telling you what's up. And I love reading her stuff for that reason. I think it just makes it super approachable. I think it makes it like, I think it just makes you as a reader like more receptive to the ideas instead of like, here are 5 things that you must do to like, reduce anxiety or whatever. No, it's much more conversational. It's much more vulnerable and honest. And really, I just find her way of writing very helpful. So, Sarah Campbell is one, and Tiny Revolutions is her Substack. Another one that jumps to mind is a guy named Tom White, and Tom's Substack is called White Noise. And what I love about Tom's writing, and I look forward to him listening to this, I feel like Tom got into a time machine and like went to the year 1850 and like pulled all the coolest words that have gone out of existence since then and like writing style and like brought it back to the future and like injects it in his writing. Like his writing is so fun to read because he has like this command of language and like depth of knowledge with the English language that I think is like super rare, because I think a lot of online content ends up being kind of homogenous because like, a lot of us are reading the same stuff and copy and pasting each other in a lot of ways. And Tom has like this super fresh, like literary informed voice that is like, I think incredibly rare to see in an online blog. And so I just love reading his stuff, White Noise. And then maybe one more I'll mention is, and I'm saying these folks because I don't think they have huge audiences yet. There's plenty of folks that like Lenny Rachitsky and Nathan Bashaz and folks that other members that I think, a guy named Jacob Donnelly, who people already might know. But one more who may not have the huge audience yet is Nick DeWild. And Nick's newsletter is called A Jungle Gym. And Nick kind of has this similarly, I guess what would the best way of describing his writing be? Like, he has this very like, I think he's very good with explaining things to folks who might be totally new to a topic. So he's almost like a very good like teacher or teacher might be the best way of saying it. Like he writes in a way that makes ideas that you probably haven't thought a ton about very approachable and inviting. And he's been doing this kind of cool thing on his Twitter where he does like a screenshot essay and they're like short essays. But I really love his approach to his newsletter as well, which goes a little bit deeper, where I think like, I don't know, you could just not have thought about a topic like he did this post on community building. And I think you'd be able to read his stuff and like very quickly see why it's interesting, very quickly kind of dive into it. And so he'd be another writer that I think that's a real skill, being able to make stuff approachable and just not intimidating for readers. So those are my 3 nominees.
Wow. Well, first of all, I appreciate the kind words, and those will all be in the show notes at dannymiranda.com/Stew, STEW. Stu, it's been a pleasure, brother. This has been an hour plus and flown by. Please tell everyone where they could find you on the interwebs.
Totally. You can Google me, Stu Fortier. I think I'm the first result. I'd be shocked if I wasn't. I don't know how many other clones are out there, but StuFortier.com is how you can kind of see my blog and subscribe to my personal newsletter, appropriately named Stu's Letter. And then I hang out on Twitter as well. So I think I'm just at Stu Fortier. And I think those are those are the 2 best places to find me. And I think it's how Dan and I found each other. So I'd love to meet some of your listeners and hit me up if you ever want feedback on a blog post.
Awesome. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for joining me, and I look forward to future conversations, my man, and reading your stuff, of course.
Truly a privilege. You are an amazing interviewer, and I can't wait to listen to some of your other guests.
Thank you, brother.
Awesome, my man. Talk to you later.
Bye.
Cool. Bye.
That was my conversation with Stu Fortier. If you enjoyed the conversation, let me know on Twitter at HeyDannyMiranda. Thank you so much for listening until the final seconds. I truly appreciate you. And please have a wonderful day. Until the next one.